Nintendo has created some of the greatest consoles in gaming history, but not all of them are remembered the same way. While some changed the landscape of modern gaming, others struggled to get off shelves. So with the Switch 2 releasing in 2025, we have entered a new era once again, prompting me to ask the question, what was the best Nintendo console? Now I'm sure you might be thinking, well obviously it's the Switch, right? It has the best technology and is basically the most profitable thing Nintendo's ever made. And to that I say, a console is more than that. I define a great console as one that not only made the most of its technology or sold a lot of games, but one that improved the overall culture of gaming. So in this video, I'm giving every console a fair shot at being the best with a double elimination tournament. At random, consoles will be seeded and placed head to head, judged on 4 crucial factors. Number 1, sales. Number 2, game library. Number 3, innovation and technological impact. And 4, cultural significance and legacy. I'll mostly break these factors down upon the first introduction of each console as to not repeat myself every time. And don't worry about the fairness of judging sales or technology, since I'll be looking at each console within its own time. Basically, did the console perform well or innovate relative to both its competition and its predecessors? Finally, instead of having every single version of each console, I'll be judging the entirety of a console's family together. With that being said, I've randomized the brackets and our first matchup is the Nintendo Entertainment System versus the Nintendo GameCube. The NES was released in North America on October 18th, 1985, during a time where the gaming market had crashed to a place that seemed unsalvageable. Fortunately, this console revitalized the industry and proved that gaming still had a place in the lives of children across the world. The NES sold about 62 million units worldwide, dominating the market at the time. But a console is nothing without games. Unfortunately, the NES had some of the most iconic IPs that have become household names today. Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Kirby. While many NES games are considered quite antiquated by today's standards, at the time it had far and away the best catalog of games that people had ever seen. This can be heavily attributed to not only great contributions on a first-party level, but also to the help from companies like Capcom, Konami, and Square, ensuring there was a wide range of fun and unique games to play. Technologically speaking, the NES definitely set the standard for a lot of what we see in gaming today. While the controller is admittedly pretty horrible, the layout is something that is still reflected in controllers today. It also really tried to market itself with unique accessories like the Zapper gun and power pad, which might not have been the most iconic things ever, but they still influenced future consoles in and out of Nintendo. Culturally, the NES is credited with saving the video game industry, and I believe it rightfully deserves that place in history. Not to mention, it created the foundation for Nintendo to have their icons like Mario, Link, and Kirby, many others. Overall, the NES wasn't a perfect console, but for its time, it certainly was. And now, the GameCube. The Nintendo GameCube was released in North America on November 18th, 2001. This time around, Nintendo decided to design their console in a sort of lunchbox design with a distinct purple color. The expectation of the GameCube was to get Nintendo back on the top of the gaming mountain after struggling in the previous generation with the rise of the PlayStation. Unfortunately, this console is perhaps where Nintendo really became the oddballs of the gaming world, since they had steep competition with the PS2 and Xbox. Sales figures on the GameCube weren't great, coming in at around 22 million units sold. This was a number a bit lower than the Xbox, but almost 140 million less than the PS2. And honestly, it's a shame. The GameCube had a fantastic game catalog consisting of classics like Twilight Princess, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and many more. This console had an incredible amount of love from Nintendo, but basically nothing significant from third parties. I mean, could you blame them? This was the disc that Nintendo required to be used for their console. The technology in the GameCube was quite strong for its time, however, maybe they got a bit overzealous with their tiny DVD idea. Besides scaring away third parties, it ensured the GameCube would never compete with the PS2's amazing DVD playing feature. It's no wonder that the PS2 outsold it by so much. It was something that every family could find a use for at the time. The GameCube's tech wasn't all bad though, as it was fairly powerful and also had one of, if not the best controller of all time. At first glance, the GameCube controller doesn't look very comfortable to hold and seems very awkward, but I'll tell you what, there's a reason so many people were begging for GameCube support when Super Smash Bros. Ultimate released on the Switch. The console also supported connectivity with the GBA, something that was pretty cool in certain games, although largely an unneeded feature in most titles. In the grand scheme of things, the GameCube is an unfortunate showcase of what happens when you innovate innovate too much and not in the right places. While it definitely had a strong impact in gaming culture within Nintendo, the world mostly forgets this console as they were too busy with their PlayStations, being able to watch movies and play online with their friends. Pitting the NES and GameCube head to head is really a battle of what you value in a console. In my opinion, the GameCube's game catalog is far superior to the NES, and I feel like the controller's phenomenal design puts it one step ahead as well. Really, the only thing I take the NES over the GameCube with is the cultural impact, and I don't know how much that really reflects on the console itself versus the marketing of it. Legacy-wise, you really don't see people going back to NES games as much as people still play GameCube titles. Nintendo themselves hasn't really gone and remade any of the games from NES either, instead remaking their SNES or Game Boy games. Since this is a double elimination situation, I'm okay with taking the GameCube over the NES, despite its struggles sales-wise. Next, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System versus the Nintendo Switch. The SNES was released in North America on August 23, 1991, with the goal of improving on the NES and competing with new players in the market like Sega. The console sold 49 million units worldwide, unable to keep that same dominance as the NES. Fair enough, considering now they had genuine competition with the Sega Genesis. All things considered, Nintendo definitely won this war, but this was the beginning of when we could see Nintendo didn't have free reign over gaming anymore. The SNES's library is truly something for the ages. With its new technological improvements alongside its continued amazing third-party support, they were able to have an army of classics on here, some of them being Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Final Fantasy VI, Super Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger, and many more. A problem with the NES is that most of its games feel old, and honestly, not that fun to play. The SNES, on the other hand, never felt that way to me. Many of its titles were able to capture that perfect feeling of good controls, pacing, writing, and decent enough graphics. The technology of the SNES wasn't anything insane, but it definitely was a massive step up from the NES. First, they slightly improved the controller of the NES so it wasn't unbearably uncomfortable to hold anymore. But perhaps the most notable of a change was the music improvement. I feel like the amount of depth that composers had with this was insane. I mean, soundtracks like Donkey Kong Country are still listened to for how relaxing they are to this day. I believe the SNES is one of the most influential consoles of all time, changing the landscape of genres like RPGs and showing that Nintendo wasn't just some fad. Next, the Nintendo Switch. The Switch was released on March 3rd, 2017, representing a pivotal moment in gaming history. For the first time, a major console was successfully made to be both a home and a handheld console in one. Following the painful era of the Wii U, Nintendo had to make a comeback, and that they did. This console has sold over 146 million units and counting, making it one of the most successful consoles ever made. Finally, Nintendo reclaimed their place in the gaming world as innovators, but it could only do this with great games in its library, and indeed, they had them. With big titles like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Animal Crossing New Horizons, Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, there was just no way it could fail. It also supported third parties a lot better than the Wii U, which is awesome due to the rise of indie games needing a home besides on the PC. Here, we saw already popular games like Stardew Valley and Undertale gain new audiences. But the goal with almost every first-party title on the Switch was to take it to a level never before seen. While not exactly the most powerful console ever, it still allowed games to evolve into the 3D open-world genre, for better or for worse. Aside from its graphical capabilities, the Switch made a massive innovation with controllers, with their Joy-Cons. Now let me be clear, these are structurally not that amazing, but as a concept, Joy-Cons were pretty awesome on release. I mean, it was pretty cool that you could go from playing handheld, then if you wanted to switch to your TV, you could just plop it in the deck and take off the Joy-Cons. Of course, Nintendo had their Pro Controller, which is amazing, I will give it that, but still. Despite the Switch being a little too ambitious and not polished in some areas, its technology is certainly iconic. The Switch brought family gaming culture back together, and it captured that feeling of any age group being able to play games, much like the Wii and DS did. The sheer amount of competition the Switch brought to the market was insane, with handheld gaming seemingly on the rise once more with the Steam Deck and other handheld PCs being popularized. Truly, the Switch was and is not a perfect console, but it really did breathe life into a console generation that had become stagnant and overpriced. While Microsoft and especially Sony had to deal with the rise of PC gaming, Nintendo stood alone and made a Switch a staple in every modern family house. For that reason, when comparing the SNES and the Switch, it really is a no-brainer. This isn't to say the NES is anywhere near a bad console, but I think even if you look at the consoles within their own times, the Switch is far more successful and influential, so it moves on to the next round. The Nintendo 64 versus the Nintendo Wii. The N64 was released in America on September 29, 1996, and was Nintendo's answer to 3D gaming being on the rise. With new competition like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, Nintendo's SNES was outdated. But when the N64 launched, Nintendo had a plan to make this console generation defining. Super Mario 64 launched as essentially the only launch title for the console, and this game changed what it meant to be a 3D game. In the past, devs have used sneaky tricks to make their 3D worlds look like they have a lot more depth than they actually do. With Mario 64, this game was fully modeled and as open world as you could get in this time. While technically not the first 3D game, it might as well have been, since every single 3D game in the future of gaming was influenced in some part by it. The console itself unfortunately struggled to get the same level of success as its predecessors, as it was completely outdone by the PlayStation. The 64 sold about 33 million units, while the PlayStation did about 102. Perhaps this was due to certain audiences starting to mature out of Nintendo, or the fact that the PlayStation came out a full 2 years before Nintendo had the 64 ready. Ultimately though, I think the tiny library of games, especially on release, was a big problem. First of all, dropping one real game on release is a terrible idea, even if it's one of the best games of all time. Also, since the PlayStation had used discs instead of cartridges, many developers decided to make games for that console. This is why one of Nintendo's strongest partnerships with Square, who had given them classics on prior consoles, was shattered in this generation. It really had nothing to do with Nintendo themselves, just that Final Fantasy VII wouldn't have fit on the N64, which is kinda crazy since this choice lost Nintendo one of the most popular franchises in the world to this day. While Square would eventually return to Nintendo a few years later, they still have never received another mainline Final Fantasy game on their system. Well, unless you count some of the old stuff they brought to the Switch. Despite poor third-party support, the 64 compensated by having classics like Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye, Super Smash Bros, and Mario Kart 64. The technology of the system was actually superior to the PlayStation in many ways. While it had really bad storage space and terrible cartridges, it was quite fast, all things considered. It also had cool features like a rumble pack, which immersed players into gaming like never before. The controller, on the other hand, was not a very cool innovation, and its design never returned in any controller ever because it sucked. To the world though, the N64 is fondly remembered as a pioneer in 3D gaming. It gained a reputation as a party game console, with it introducing classic party game franchises like Smash Bros and Mario Party. It might not have been the winner of the console wars, but it still is a classic in gaming history. The Nintendo Wii released on November 19th, 2006 and had the intention of shaking up the gaming world. At this point, Nintendo realized it could never compete technologically with the likes of Sony and Microsoft, so they decided to go the route of full-on family gaming and innovation. The main gimmick of the Wii was its motion controls. Using the familiarity of television, it framed itself as being a gaming television, with different channels reflecting different games and applications. While this gimmicky marketing would be a big risk, it absolutely paid off for them, allowing Nintendo to once again win the console wars after years of being dominated by Sony. The Wii sold over 101 million copies, beating out the insanely powerful PS3 and Xbox 360. They were able to do this by finally learning from their mistakes and finding their niche. The Wii released with one of the most impressive launch catalogs we've ever seen. While it was distinctly missing anything Mario related for a while, it had both first and third-party classics across the board. On the Nintendo side, there was The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess and Wii Sports. But third-party, there was Madden 07, Trauma Center Second Opinion, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2, and dozens more. In the coming years, the Wii would get its first-party classics like Mario Galaxy, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Xenoblade, and Metroid Prime. This console has one of the strongest and most diverse libraries of games that we've ever seen. There is literally something for everyone. And I haven't even mentioned that it was released with the Virtual Console, allowing you to play classics from Nintendo's past for a very reasonable price. While the technology of the Wii was nowhere near the power of the PS3 or Xbox 360, they were able to attract all different types of audiences through its ridiculous amount of games, interesting controls, and competitive pricing. I mean, the PS3 was basically double the price of the Wii and had a far worse launch catalog of games. The world loved the Wii, and it became an essential in any household that played games. If you were a kid and you got invited to a friend's house, you could expect to play Super Smash Bros. Brawl or Mario Party 8 or Mario Kart Wii. Personally, this is my childhood console, but even putting nostalgia aside, I think it's one of the best of all time. While we cannot deny the significance of the N64, I cannot put it above the Wii in basically any category, and for that reason, the Wii moves on. The Wii U versus the Game Boy Advance. The Wii U was released on November 18, 2012 and was Nintendo's attempt at building on the massive success of the Wii. The main feature of the Wii U was its gamepad, which allowed dual screen interaction. Despite this actually very cool step forward in technology, this console failed tremendously bad and was destroyed in competition with the PS4 and Xbox One. Despite having the head start on them, the Wii U sold 13.56 million units, basically a 90 million unit drop from the Wii. In comparison, the PS4 sold 117 million units and the Xbox One sold about 58 million. There are plenty of places to direct the blame, but the games are certainly a reason why. On launch, there was a lot of games, sure, but there wasn't a hit game. The best thing here was Super Mario Bros. U, which is basically the same game as the Wii version. Later, the Wii U would get more first-party titles like Super Mario 3D World, Mario Kart 8, Super Smash Bros., and Splatoon. Honestly, there was a lot of great first-party titles on the Wii U, however, none would be enough to be a console seller. In my opinion, the best game on there is the Wind Waker HD, which is a GameCube game. I also don't count Breath of the Wild as a Wii U game because it was released on the Wii U the same day as the Switch came out, so realistically, most people just bought the Switch version. The third-party support on the Wii U was decent, but nowhere near the strength of the Wii, so overall, this console's library was cooked. The innovation we saw in the Wii U should have been enough to gain popularity, but it just wasn't. I mean, you would think taking the dual screen idea from your most successful handheld and applying it to your most successful home console would result in a legendary piece of hardware. But alas, the Wii U is not remembered for its improvements, but for ushering in the dark age of Nintendo in the mid-2010s. This was a time where people started to hate cash grabs like Amiibo and relying on remasters to sell things. We also started to enter a time of Nintendo where nothing was new. Franchises like Mario Party and Paper Mario had any sort of creativity sucked out of them. Realistically, the reason for the Wii U's failure had to do with awful branding and marketing, lack of care for the consumer, and third-party abandonment. The GBA released on March 21st, 2001 and was the successor to the ever-successful Game Boy. With its significant hardware improvements, diverse library of games, and backwards compatibility, this was the answer to all things handheld gaming. The console was a massive success, as the industry was due for Nintendo to drop their next big upgrade in handhelds. They basically had no competition in this market, and as a result sold over 81 million units during its lifetime. Funnily enough, its launch titles kind of sucked. Over the next few years though, it would receive a phenomenal catalog of games with some of the best Pokemon, Zelda, and Mario games of all time. We would also get a lot of third-party support returning to Nintendo after they struggled greatly in the days of the N64. Square returned and brought Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts to the GBA, at least the games that could run on there. Later on, the GBA would receive a superior version called the Game Boy Advance SP, which had a better screen, rechargeable battery, and a clamshell design. In a time where Nintendo home consoles had struggled tremendously against the all-powerful PlayStations, this was just the thing Nintendo needed to stay on top of the gaming world in some capacity. Usually it's not a bad thing when one company dominates a market, but when it comes to this, I think it worked out perfectly. Nintendo made sure the GBA had a fantastic catalog of games, despite its very short life. Comparing the Wii U and GBA is basically useless. I think we all know the answer. The GBA moves on. The Nintendo DS versus the Nintendo GameCube. The DS launched on November 21st, 2004 with the goal of once again innovating in the space of handheld gaming. While the Game Boy Advance had been fairly successful, it was clear that Nintendo's monopoly on that side of gaming wouldn't last forever. The concept of the DS was to utilize two screens at once, using the clamshell design we saw in the GBA SP. After many iterations, the DS was able to dominate in the market for years, with the family of consoles selling over 154 million units. This would make it the best-selling Nintendo console of all time and second best-selling console of all time. Its direct competition, the PSP, would also perform quite well, selling 80 million copies. Perhaps people at the time were just really in a mood for handheld gaming. While the gimmick of dual screens was certainly a reason for this success, the games on the DS were a much more important factor. Its launch titles were pretty horrible though, with the only real game of substance being Mario 64 DS. They actually didn't bother releasing any more games for the holidays that year, which is a strange choice, but clearly it didn't affect them long term. And aside from Nintendogs, the next year was also very dead until the holiday season when they dropped Mario Kart DS, Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, WarioWare, and Animal Crossing. And well, from there the games didn't stop coming. After a while, we got classics like the Pokemon games, New Super Mario Bros., Professor Layton, and Bowser's Inside Story. Of course, first-party titles weren't the only reason for the DS's massive success. With the help of Capcom, Atlus, Square, and many other smaller studios, the DS was able to have something for everyone. In my opinion, the DS has the best library of games out of almost any Nintendo console, and considering how important games are to a console's legacy, it's hard to imagine the DS losing in a tournament like this. As for the technology, the DS evolved over all of its iterations. With massive upgrades from the GBA and the capacity to be backwards compatible, people had little reason to own a GBA anymore. The original DS was quite clunky, but with the DS Lite, everyone started getting one. While it was called the Lite, it was actually an upgrade across the board. It was lighter, had a better screen, better battery life, better stylus, and had a ton of color variations to appease different audiences. The other version of the DS that would later release was the DSi. This was pretty much a further upgraded version of the DS Lite, which had features like a camera and its own digital shop with exclusive software. The DS is perhaps the most significant console to ever exist in terms of cultural impact. With its much more casual focus, it was able to capture the hearts of people who didn't even play games previously. In 1988, Nintendo reported that 27% of the NES's players in the US were female. In 2006, before even the prime of the DS, that number was 44%. I remember growing up sharing a pink DS Lite with my mom and playing games like Animal Crossing Wild World and Ace Attorney. I'm sure that some of you watching might have had a similar experience if you're around my age too. Since we already went over the GameCube, I'm sure you can assume what I'm going to say about this matchup. They're both great consoles, don't get me wrong, but the library and overwhelming success of the DS is too much to ignore. It moves on. The Nintendo 3DS versus the Switch. The 3DS launched on March 27, 2011 and was the long-awaited successor to the DS family. While everything was relatively the same from the DS conceptually, the 3DS added a ton of features both in hardware and in software. Throughout its many iterations, it competed with the PS Vita, but unlike last generation, Nintendo absolutely destroyed Sony. The 3DS sold almost 76 million units, while the Vita sold somewhere between 10 and 15. Much like the DS, the 3DS prided itself on insanely strong first-party titles with a plethora of good third-party options as well. However, it basically had no real launch titles. I remember getting the 3DS on release with my dad, and then literally not remembering anything else about the console for the next few months. And this is because the most significant game there for a 6-year-old boy was Pilot Wings Resort. I'm pretty sure I literally just played the demos of Street Fighter and Asphalt 3D for a few months until the real game started to come out. Midway through the year, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D released, and then for the holidays, the 3DS's big sellers were Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7. The next year was also pretty abysmal in terms of Nintendo releasing console movers. They released New Super Mario Bros. 2, which got a ton of hate despite being a pretty good game, likely due to Nintendo dropping so few impactful and innovative titles. Besides that, Nintendo dropped 2 other games that are infamous to this day. Kid Icarus Uprising was great, but like, have we seen the franchise return since? And the other game was Sticker Star, which was a horrible step down in the Paper Mario franchise. 2011 and 2012 were some dark times for Nintendo, that's for sure. Fortunately, 2013 was one of Nintendo's best years in a while. Animal Crossing New Leaf, The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, Pokemon X and Y, Mario and Luigi Dream Team. This year was packed. The year of Luigi really helped revive love for Nintendo, at least on the 3DS. From this point, we never really had a bad year of the 3DS, with games like Smash and Pokemon keeping hype for the console alive. We also saw an incredible amount of 3D remakes come to the console, which some people loved and some people didn't. The cool thing about the 3DS though is the eShop, which gave us virtual console access to a ton of old titles. With all of the versions of the 3DS, it's kind of funny to see how it ended. Starting off, it was a cool gimmick, and paired with the new circle pad, the 3DS was innovative enough. Ultimately though, nobody actually used the 3D feature of the 3DS since it just made the games hard to look at. If you ask me, this was a waste of resources, but regardless, they kept it in every version of the system until the 2DS. In my opinion though, the pinnacle of the 3DS design is the new 3DS XL. This boasted 2 massive screens, a comfortable feel, and plenty of new hardware features. I still have this console to this day, and it's super fun to play whenever I'm bored of modern games. In terms of impact, the 3DS did not really change the game like the DS did. For a while, the 3DS felt like it was just coasting and getting by on occasional decent releases. Once the Wii U became an obvious failure though, the 3DS received the attention it deserved. Nevertheless, the 3DS partially contributed to the downfall of Nintendo in the pre-Switch era, which makes it lose some points for me. Considering this matchup is between the Switch and the 3DS, I don't really see how the Switch loses this. Sure, the 3DS eventually became a great console, but the Switch did it instantly, saving Nintendo from the mess they made. For that, the Switch moves on once more. The Game Boy family versus the Wii. The Game Boy was Nintendo's first real shot at handheld gaming consoles. The original Game Boy was released in America in July 1989, and it ended up performing quite well. The combined sales of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color ended around 118 million units, which makes it one of the best consoles ever commercially. This could definitely be attributed to the lack of competition, but the console also had a great library of games. On release, it pretty much had Tetris and Mario Land as notable games, but over time it developed quite the collection, featuring Kirby, Final Fantasy, Mega Man, The Legend of Zelda, and yes, Pokemon. Despite its dominance in the handheld market, it didn't really have the greatest technology in the world. The lighting of the screen sucked, the battery life was good at the time, but still expensive considering all the batteries you had to use, and well, the graphics weren't that great either. But you kinda have to look at the Game Boy in a unique light. This is easily Nintendo's longest console generation, lasting over a decade. When you bring in the Game Boy Color, it's easier to see why it's remembered fondly though. This console only lasted a few years, but improved a ton about the Game Boy's original. It had brand new games along with improved versions of classics, of course this time with color. I definitely have to attribute a lot of the success of the Game Boy to the insane comeback Pokemon gave it. This franchise alone had such an impact on the sales, moving millions of units of a console generation that was seemingly at the end of its life. The legacy of the Game Boy is that of the first successful handheld console. This introduced many of the biggest franchises Nintendo has today, and without it, handheld gaming wouldn't be where it is today. While the games aren't really that fun to play anymore, it was a spectacle in its time. Sadly for the Game Boy, going up against the Wii is a death sentence, which establishes the final four of the winners bracket as the GBA, DS, Switch, and Wii. Now let's go some of the losers though. The NES versus the GameCube is not a very hard decision. While the NES did change the landscape of the gaming world and performed well commercially, the games just aren't that fun anymore. And it's not like the GameCube didn't also have influence, just on a different scale. If you grew up with the NES, I could see how you'd pick it over the GameCube, but for me, I just couldn't. The Wii U versus the 3DS, the battle of which console was the best during the Nintendo Dark Ages. I think this choice is obvious. The 3DS is way better than the Wii U in every way. The SNES versus the N64. This is probably the first difficult matchup in losers, and that's because there's different reasons to like one over the other. While the N64 is far and away the most powerful console, some would argue that its library doesn't touch the SNES. Losing all of that third-party support in the 64 really hurt Nintendo, and those few massive hits like Mario 64 and Zelda might not be enough to get it over the hump. I mean, think about the amount of classics that are still on the SNES and fun to this day, and how it basically pioneered the RPG genre. If you ask me though, I think the SNES aged far better than most games on the N64. Realistically, we're comparing the pinnacle of 2D home console gaming versus the dawn of 3D home consoles. So with that, the SNES wins. Alright, now back in the winners bracket, we start off with a heated matchup between the GBA and DS. At first glance, you might immediately say the DS wins, and I do share that sentiment in some capacity. The DS family is essentially a complete upgrade from the GBA. It has two screens with better lighting, more comfortable design, and better hardware. The game side of things might cause some speculation though. The GBA's library is nothing to take lightly, and it also helped get third parties back into making games for Nintendo consoles. Unfortunately for the GBA, everything that it did, the DS did better. Not to mention the DS can literally play GBA games, so the DS moves on to the finals of winners bracket. Now we have the Switch versus the Wii. These were two home consoles that changed everything for Nintendo through the powers of strong games and innovation. Both of these consoles sold over 100 million copies and hosted Nintendo's greatest games of all time. Realistically, these two functioned in the same way culturally. The Wii helped bring casual gaming to the home console market once again after the struggles of the GameCube, firmly competing with the PS3 and Xbox 360 and winning that war. And the Switch, well, it actually did the same thing. It saved Nintendo from the failing Wii U and won the battle against the PS5 and Xbox Series X. So to me, this is really just the battle of libraries. Once again, these are similar in the sense that they both have the classic 3D Mario game, a massive Super Smash Bros, a big Zelda release or two, and tons of third-party support. While I definitely think the Virtual Console also contributes to the strength of the Wii's library, I think the Switch literally just has too many franchises' best games. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Mario Odyssey, Smash Ultimate, Mario Kart 8, all of these just make it insane. And on a third-party front, not only does the Switch have familiar faces like Atlus and Square, but also gives a platform for indie developers to get their games out to new audiences. Look, I grew up with a Wii, so maybe it'll find its way out of losers bracket, but I just can't put it over the Switch. Now, the next round of losers. The GameCube versus the 3DS. These two consoles are quite different in every way. One is the black sheep of Nintendo's home consoles, while the other is functionally one of the best handhelds ever made. I might have said some negative things about the 3DS, but it's still very fond to me and I'm sure many others. It had a rocky start, but its longevity is what made the console ultimately successful. And well, I can't say the same about the GameCube, so the 3DS moves on. The Game Boy versus the SNES. In their time, I genuinely wonder what people would say about this matchup, because even then, the Game Boy had terrible graphics and wasn't modern by any means, even with the Game Boy Color. But the very fact that the Game Boy was handheld at the time, when there was nothing like it, leads me to believe there would be a lot of fans for the Game Boy. Boy. Personally, I think the SNES has a far better catalog of games and they have aged with a lot more grace than the Game Boy. Although it is a shame that such an influential console like the Game Boy wasn't able to pick up a single win in this tournament. While we're at it, let's do another round of Losers Bracket. GBA versus 3DS. Look, if the GBA didn't beat the DS, it's certainly not beating the 3DS. This console is able to play DS games and GBA games, and much more comfortably at that, so it seems like the 3DS is catching fire and its Cinderella story continues. The SNES versus the Wii. This is the moment where I feel the SNES's run ends. While it was able to get past the N64 and the Game Boy, the Wii pretty much has it beat in every way. Not only can the Wii play SNES games, but it can play GameCube games, N64 games, NES, and well, you get it. The library of games the Wii has is insane, so I'm gonna move it along to face the 3DS. These two consoles are near and dear to my heart, and picking between them is difficult. At this point in the tournament, we know the stories about all of these consoles, and it really is just a matter of what I still find enjoyable today. What can I pick up and play and not feel like it's antiquated or anything negative? And well, my answer to that is there's literally a modded 3DS on my desk as I make this, while my Wii hasn't been touched in months. I'll give the Wii this. You could definitely argue it having a better library than the 3DS, but honestly, I like DS games a lot more than the Wii's. And guess what? I can play those games on the 3DS. So with that being said, I'm moving the 3DS to the Losers Bracket Finals. Back to winners, we have our first finals matchup. The DS versus the Nintendo Switch. The best-selling Nintendo console in history versus the best-selling Nintendo console of today. This might be the hardest matchup yet, which tells me I did a great job picking the winners in this tournament. Within their own times, they are nearly peerless. The DS doubled the sales of the PSP, and the Switch sold more than the PS5 and Series X combined. Both of these consoles also helped expand the horizons of casual gaming through handhelds. To me, the DS is the reason why I got into gaming. From my earliest memories, I remember having a DS in my hands. The games there taught me how to read, gave me a consistent place of peace in a world that was always changing. The Switch, on the other hand, might not have been as nostalgic for me, but I'm sure it did the same for kids of this time, and I have plenty of memories of the Switch anyway. The Switch gave people a place to escape to during one of the hardest times in the modern world. Games like Animal Crossing New Horizons became household names due to how perfect it was for those isolated days. While the child in me wants to move the DS on to the grand finals, I can't deny how significant the Switch's ability was to be both handheld and docked. So the finals of Losers Bracket will be the DS versus the 3DS. How funny that it ends up being these two, each falling to the Switch at one point. Look, if you ask me, the DS has a better standalone library of games than the 3DS. It also did sell more and have a stronger cultural impact. But I want you to consider this too. The 3DS might have been a factor in Nintendo's downfall, but it was also the reason why it could stay afloat at all. And you know what? The 3DS generation lasted just as long as the DS, so it's not like it was just a blip in history either. To me though, judging a console's library is more than its own releases. I definitely put care into things like virtual consoles and backwards compatibility. And well, the DSi technically had 4 of those, but besides that, the 3DS clearly wins in that area. And if we look at longevity, the 3DS is pretty damn powerful and able to be modded with relative ease. The new 3DS XL is a generational console that I don't think I'll ever stop playing. It just feels right to play games on there, even if I could just play it on my PC through emulators. So against all odds, the 3DS survives Losers Bracket and makes it to grand finals against the Nintendo Switch. But this is where my job as the creator goes to you. I already said how I feel comparing the 3DS and the Switch earlier in the video, but I want to know what you guys think. In the comments, let me know what you think is better, the Switch or the 3DS, or just let me know what your favorite console is of all time. Also, I'm trying to hit 10k subs this year, but almost 99% of my viewers aren't even subscribed, so I'd love for you to help me out with that goal. I also have a Patreon in the top link of the description if you want to participate in polls, get behind the scene videos, and support the channel. Thanks for watching.